The thin morning light, usually a comforting embrace in my quiet Brooklyn brownstone, felt more like a spotlight today, harsh and unforgiving. It picked out the dust motes dancing in the air, the faint lines around my eyes in the mirror, and the heavy, unshakable weight in my chest. Today was the day. The reading of Arthur's will. Another finality in a string of finalities that had begun 6 months ago when his heart, so strong and steady for 50 years by my side, had simply given out. I moved through the familiar rituals of my morning like a ghost. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, usually a vibrant punctuation mark in my day, was muted, almost an insult. I watched the steam curl from the ceramic mug, Arthur's favorite, the one with the chipped rim from that summer in Maine, and felt a familiar prickle behind my eyes. No, Evelyn, I told myself, a silent, firm command. Not today. Not yet. I chose my attire with meticulous care. Not for vanity, but for armor. A charcoal gray suit, impeccably tailored, a silk scarf in a muted blue, a string of pearls, Arthur's first gift to me. It was the uniform of a grieving widow, dignified and composed. It was the mask I would wear to face the world, and more importantly, to face Scarlett, my daughter-in-law. The drive to Mr. Harper's office downtown was a blur of familiar streets and unfamiliar thoughts. The city, usually a symphony of honks and distant sirens, sounded muted, absorbed by the hum of my old Buick. My hands, still steady despite my 72 years, gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. I rehearsed my polite greetings, my mournful nods, the carefully chosen phrases of acceptance. I was prepared for the dry legal pronouncements, the awkward silences, the subtle power plays. I was prepared for everything, or so I thought. As I pulled up to the curb, a figure detached itself from the shadows of a nearby alley. He was a man, thin and gaunt, his clothes a patchwork of grime and tears, his hair a tangled mess. A homeless man. He moved with a sudden, alarming speed, lurching towards my car just as I turned the ignition. Before I could even fully register his presence, he was there, his face pressed against my window, his eyes wide and wild, filled with an intensity that pierced through the glass. He hammered on the window with a desperate urgency, his voice a hoarse, guttural cry that somehow cut through the sealed glass. "Ma'am, don't start that car. Please, for God's sake, don't start that car." My hand froze on the key. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I stared at him, bewildered, a wave of fear, cold and sharp, washing over me. What was he talking about? Was he dangerous? Was he simply mad? Then his voice dropped, a frantic whisper that was nonetheless clear, chilling me to the bone. "Your daughter-in-law, she's a killer." The words hung in the air, solid and terrifying. My breath hitched. Killer? Scarlett? The very idea was ludicrous, horrifying. Before I could process the accusation, before I could even formulate a single question, the man stumbled back, his eyes darting nervously down the street. He turned, a sudden, desperate movement, and vanished back into the labyrinthine shadows of the alley as quickly as he had appeared. My blood ran cold. Killer. The word echoed in the confined space of my car, a venomous whisper. It was impossible. Madness. But the look in his eyes, the sheer, raw terror. It was real. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, the engine still off. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the senseless. Was this some cruel joke? A deranged man's ramblings? Or a warning? A seed of doubt, dark and poisonous, began to bloom in the carefully tended garden of my composure. Reluctantly, my hands shaking slightly, I started the car. The engine rumbled to life, a familiar sound that now seemed sinister, echoing the unsettling words. I drove the last block to Mr. Harper's office, the image of the man's face, his desperate warning, branded into my mind. Inside the elegant, hushed waiting room, my son David was already there, his face drawn, looking exhausted. And then there was Scarlett. She sat on the edge of a plush leather chair, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleaming, her designer dress a stark contrast to my own modest attire. She offered a tight, almost artificial smile. "Evelyn," she said, her voice smooth, almost purring. "So glad you could make it." I returned her greeting, a polite, almost imperceptible nod. I walked towards the conference room, my gaze fixed on her. As I stepped through the doorway, as her eyes met mine across the polished mahogany table, something extraordinary, something utterly inexplicable, happened. Scarlett's face, usually a mask of flawless poise, drained of all color. Her lips parted slightly, a gasp caught in her throat. She swayed, a small, involuntary stagger, her hand flying to her chest. Then, with a soft, almost theatrical sigh, she crumpled to the floor. She fainted. At the sight of me, my blood, already chilled by the homeless man's frantic warning, now froze solid. "Ma'am, don't start that car. Your daughter-in-law, she's a killer." And now this inexplicable collapse. A single, chilling thought, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of my grief and bewilderment. He called her a leech. And a killer. This was no coincidence. Not now. Chaos erupted, a flurry of hurried movements and hushed exclamations. David, ever the devoted husband, was instantly by Scarlett's side, his face a mask of concern. Mr. Harper, the solicitor, a man whose composure was usually as unyielding as his impeccably starched collars, looked momentarily flustered. Assistants rushed in with water and smelling salts. I stood rooted to the spot, a silent, unmoving observer amidst the commotion, my gaze unwavering on Scarlett's pale, unconscious face. When she finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering open like a fragile butterfly's wings, she looked disoriented, her eyes unfocused. David helped her to a chair, murmuring words of comfort. But as her gaze swept the room, landing on me, a flicker, something akin to fear or perhaps cunning, danced in their depths before she quickly averted them. She offered a weak smile, a delicate hand pressed to her temple. "Just a little overwhelmed, I suppose," she whispered, her voice reedy and thin. "It's been a lot." Mr. Harper, having regained his professional demeanor, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a short break?" "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though inside I felt anything but. "Let us proceed, Mr. Harper. Arthur would have wanted us to finish this." My words held a double meaning, a subtle challenge that seemed to briefly tighten Scarlett's lips. The reading of the will resumed, the solemn rhythm of Mr. Harper's voice filling the room. Most of Arthur's considerable estate, as I had expected, was bequeathed to me. The house, the investments, the various trusts he had meticulously built over our lifetime together. It was a testament to our partnership, our shared future now irrevocably altered. But then, Mr. Harper paused, adjusting his spectacles. "And to my dear daughter-in-law, Scarlett O'Connor," he began, "in recognition of her dedication to the family's future and to ensure the continued legacy of the O'Connor enterprises, I bequeath a significant portion of my shares in O'Connor Holdings, to be held in trust under her sole management with full voting rights for a period of 10 years. My breath caught. A significant portion? Under her sole management? For 10 years? It was unprecedented. Arthur, for all his traditional values, was a shrewd businessman. He compartmentalized, he protected. He had always been wary of handing over too much control, even to David, who was his own son and had worked in the company for decades. To Scarlett, who, while intelligent and ambitious, had never truly integrated herself into the core operations, this seemed utterly out of character for Arthur. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The words of the homeless man echoed again. "She's a killer." And now this unexpected clause, granting Scarlett such formidable power. It felt less like a gift and more like a transaction. My internal monologue, usually a quiet hum, was now a frantic chorus. Scarlett. Always so polite, so perfectly composed. Yet there had always been an underlying chill, a sense of calculation. I recalled the subtle ways she'd tried to influence Arthur in his later years, nudging him towards certain investments, suggesting changes in business strategy. I dismissed them then as youthful ambition, perhaps a misguided attempt to prove herself. Now, they seemed like pieces of a much larger, darker mosaic. There was that incident with the charity gala last year. Arthur had intended to make a substantial donation to my preferred arts foundation. Scarlett, with her charming smile, had somehow redirected it to a more high-profile social cause that she championed. Arthur, surprisingly, hadn't argued. He'd simply shrugged and said, "Whatever makes you happy, dear." At the time, I'd thought it was just him mellowing with age. Now, I wondered if it was something more insidious. After the formalities were concluded, and Mr. Harper had offered his condolences once more, I tried to approach David. He looked drawn, his brow furrowed with worry. "David, dear," I began, my voice soft, cautious. "Are you all right?" And that clause in the will about Scarlett's shares. It seemed unusual. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, sighing deeply. "Mother, please. It's been a terrible day. Scarlett's just stressed, she's not herself. As for the shares, Dad always wanted to ensure the company's stability. He probably thought Scarlett's business acumen would be an asset. You know how much he valued a strong hand." He avoided my gaze, a telltale sign of his discomfort. "A strong hand, yes," I murmured, but she always seemed more interested in the social aspects of the business than the day-to-day operations. David simply shrugged, turning away. "It's what Dad wanted. We have to respect his wishes." But his voice lacked conviction, and I saw a flicker of anxiety in his eyes before he turned to help Scarlett out of the office. He was troubled. He might not admit it, but he knew something was off. I watched them leave, David's arm protectively around Scarlett's waist, her head resting feebly on his shoulder. They looked like the perfect, devoted couple. But the image was fractured in my mind, split by the frantic cry of a homeless man and the inexplicable faint of a devoted daughter-in-law. The first shadows, long and cold, were beginning to stretch across the carefully manicured landscape of my grief. And a chilling realization began to dawn. The reading of Arthur's will wasn't the end of my mourning. It was the beginning of a battle I never knew I had to fight. My drive home was a blur of heightened senses and fragmented thoughts. The city, once a comforting backdrop, now felt charged with unseen threats. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every passing car a potential observer. The carefully constructed piece of my widowhood had shattered, revealing a raw, unsettling undercurrent of suspicion. Stepping into my brownstone, the familiar scent of old books and dried lavender, usually so soothing, now felt alien. This house, our sanctuary for decades, seemed to watch me with a new, critical eye. Every object, every photograph, was a relic of Arthur, and suddenly, Arthur himself felt less like a beloved memory and more like an enigma. Had I truly known him? Or had I simply seen the man he presented to me, the successful businessman, the loving husband, behind whom lay a labyrinth of secrets? I bypassed my usual routine, the cup of tea, the gentle unwinding. My mind was a whirlwind of questions, all circling back to the homeless man's words and Scarlett's dramatic collapse. I walked into Arthur's study, a room I had always revered as his private domain, a place of quiet contemplation and industrious work. Now, it felt like a vault. His desk, usually meticulously organized, was just as I had left it, a testament to his orderly mind. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cold surface of the mahogany. Where to begin? I wasn't a detective. I was a retired art history teacher, a grandmother. But a fierce resolve, dormant for years, now stirred within me. I was Arthur's wife, and I would protect his legacy and my family from whatever insidious force was at play. I started with his desk drawers, gently pulling them open. Old receipts, legal documents, a few personal letters, mostly from colleagues, congratulating him on various achievements. Nothing overtly suspicious. Yet, a peculiar unease settled over me. It was too clean, too perfect. Arthur had a habit of keeping a small, leather-bound notebook for his personal thoughts, his jottings, sometimes even sketching an idea. I hadn't seen it since his death. I searched through the various compartments, feeling a strange mixture of intrusion and desperate necessity. Finally, tucked away beneath a stack of old financial reports in a bottom drawer, I found it. Small, unassuming, its pages slightly dog-eared. His handwriting, a precise, elegant script, filled the pages. I began to read. Most entries were mundane: appointments, reminders, grocery lists. But then, intermingled with the everyday, were scattered, almost cryptic notes. Dates, followed by single words or fragmented phrases. Leverage points. Risk mitigation. And then an unexpected name, repeated several times: Leopold. And alongside it, a string of numbers that looked like financial transactions, but without any context, they were meaningless. Leopold. The name pricked at my memory, a faint echo from a distant past. What was Leopold? A person? A place? As I leafed through the pages, flashes of Arthur came to me in vivid, almost painful detail. Arthur, at the dinner table, recounting a successful business deal, his eyes alight with intelligent fire. Arthur, reading in his favorite armchair, the lamplight illuminating his distinguished profile. Arthur, holding my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. He had always been so rational, so controlled. But sometimes, especially in his later years, I'd noticed a certain distance in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond age. A guardedness. I dismissed it as the burden of a successful man. Now, I wondered if it was the weight of secrets. My gaze fell on a photograph on the desk, Arthur and me, smiling, arm in arm, at our 40th wedding anniversary. He looked so happy, so contented. Could a man capable of such warmth also be entangled in something so dark that it would elicit the warnings of a stranger? The image of the homeless man, Jimmy, as he had called himself, flashed into my mind. His desperation was undeniable. He had something to say, something he hadn't finished. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that I had to find him again. He was the only thread, however frayed, connecting Scarlett's bizarre behavior to something tangible. I left the study, the notebook clutched in my hand, and drove back to the street where I had parked earlier. The afternoon sun was softer now, casting long shadows, but the alley still looked menacing. I parked and got out, feeling exposed and vulnerable. I walked the perimeter, peering into every dark recess, calling out softly, "Jimmy? Are you here?" Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Just as despair began to set in, a rustling in a pile of discarded cardboard boxes startled me. A face, grimy and whiskered, peered out. It was him. Jimmy. His eyes, though still wary, held a spark of recognition. "You came back," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. You said my daughter-in-law was a killer," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did you mean?" He hesitated, glancing around nervously. "She paid me, lady," he muttered, pulling his thin frame from the boxes. "Paid me to scare someone. Said it was a joke. A prank. But she looked hungry. Like a wolf." He shivered, despite the mild afternoon. "I didn't know it was you. You looked nice. Like my grandma. What did she want you to do?" I pressed, my heart pounding. "Just a yell," he said, shaking his head. "Yell at some lady getting into her car, tell her something crazy. Something to rattle her." But then I saw her with him. "Who?" "That big man," Jimmy whispered, his eyes widening. "Used to see him with Mr. O'Connor sometimes. At the back entrance of that fancy club. He'd arrive in a black car, expensive. And Scarlett, she was with him. In the alley. They were talking about papers. His papers. Mr. O'Connor's papers. And about the old man being done." Done. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. Jimmy nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, like he was in the way." And then, a few days later, I heard about Mr. O'Connor passing. It stuck with me, lady. Stuck with me. She was always trying to get things from him. From the old man. Always watching him. My blood ran cold for the second time that day. Done. And then Arthur's death. It all began to coalesce into a horrifying, unspeakable picture. The big man with Scarlett, the papers, the mysterious name Leopold in Arthur's notebook. And Scarlett's fainting spell. It wasn't stress. It was fear. Fear that I knew too much. I looked at Jimmy, this disheveled, forgotten man, who held the keys to a truth I desperately needed, a truth that could shatter my entire world. "Thank you, Jimmy," I said, a newfound resolve hardening my voice. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded, a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "Be careful, lady," he warned. "She's got a dark one in her." I looked at the alley, then back at my home, once a bastion of peace, now a stage for a brewing storm. The game had begun. And I, Evelyn O'Connor, the grieving widow, was no longer just a spectator. I was a player. And I would uncover every last one of Arthur's secrets, no matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. The small, leather-bound notebook became my constant companion, a silent confidant in the labyrinthine journey I had reluctantly embarked upon. Back in my study, the lamplight casting long shadows, I reread the cryptic entries, my fingers tracing the precise curves of Arthur's handwriting. Leopold. The name continued to prick at the edges of my memory, a faint, almost forgotten whisper from a world Arthur rarely discussed. It wasn't a person, I realized, not directly. It was the name of a club. The Leopold Club. An exclusive, almost mythical establishment for gentlemen, nestled discreetly in a historic, brownstone-lined street not far from Wall Street. Arthur had been a member for decades, though he rarely spoke of it. It was a place where powerful men conducted hushed conversations over aged brandy and thick cigar smoke, a bastion of old money and influence. I recalled him attending occasional events, always returning with a certain air of discreet satisfaction, never divulging details. My impression had been of a harmless, if slightly archaic, social institution. Now, with Jimmy's words ringing in my ears about the big man and back entrances, Leopold took on a far more sinister hue. My initial attempts to glean information were subtle. I searched online, but the club's digital footprint was minimal, almost non-existent, a testament to its old-world exclusivity. A brief mention in an archived society column, a historical anecdote about its founding fathers. Nothing of substance that could shed light on Arthur's cryptic notes or the strange financial figures scrawled next to Leopold. Meanwhile, Scarlett's behavior became increasingly intrusive. She called almost daily, ostensibly to check in on me, her voice dripping with a saccharine concern that scraped against my nerves. "Are you getting enough rest, Evelyn dear? The shock of it all, you know. Arthur's affairs can be so taxing." Each call felt less like genuine care and more like an interrogation. She'd casually ask if I'd found any interesting papers or if I needed help organizing Arthur's things. Her eyes, when she visited, would dart around the study, lingering on the desk, on the bookshelves, a predatory gleam in their depths. One afternoon, she arrived unannounced, bearing a casserole I politely declined. While I was in the kitchen making tea, I heard a faint clatter from the study. When I returned, she was standing by Arthur's desk, her hand still hovering over a stack of old photo albums. "Oh, Evelyn. I was just admiring these old photographs. Arthur was such a handsome man." She offered a wistful sigh, but her gaze was too sharp, too appraising. Later that day, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the corner of the small, leather-bound notebook, a smudge that hadn't been there before. Had she touched it? Had she seen it? The paranoia tightened its grip. Another time, she accidentally spilled coffee on a box of Arthur's old business correspondence. "Oh, my heavens, Evelyn, I am so dreadfully sorry," she cried, rushing to dab at the staining papers, her movements a little too frantic. I suspected she was trying to see what the letters contained, perhaps hoping to damage them beyond recognition. I calmly took the box, reassuring her with a tight smile. Every accident, every helpful suggestion was a thinly veiled probe, a relentless attempt to discover what I knew or what I was looking for. I realized I couldn't rely on public records or general knowledge for information about Leopold. I needed to tap into the past, into the hushed networks of old New York society, the kind of world Arthur had inhabited long before he met me. I remembered Mrs. Albright, a formidable woman from my bridge club, whose late husband had also been a member of several exclusive gentlemen's clubs, including, if my memory served me right, the Leopold. She was a gossip, yes, but a well-informed one, with a memory like a steel trap. A few days later, under the guise of a social call, I visited Mrs. Albright. Her opulent apartment, filled with antiques and the scent of expensive potpourri, was a world away from the gritty alleyways where Jimmy eked out a living. We exchanged pleasantries, discussed the latest society news, and then, ever so casually, I steered the conversation. "It's funny, Mrs. Albright," I began, pouring her another cup of Earl Grey. Going through Arthur's things, I came across an old membership card for the Leopold Club. I'd quite forgotten he was a member. Such a distinguished institution, isn't it? Mrs. Albright's eyes, usually a sparkling blue, seemed to dim slightly, a shadow passing over them. "Oh, the Leopold," she mused, stirring her tea. "Yes, distinguished, certainly. My late husband, Edgar, was also a member for many years, though he never spoke much of its deeper dealings." She paused, taking a delicate sip. "It had a reputation, you know. Not just for its excellent cuisine and fine cigars, but for being a place where certain matters were handled discreetly, away from prying eyes." My heart gave a little flutter. "Matters? What kind of matters, dear?" I tried to keep my voice light, innocent. She lowered her voice, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Oh, you know, Evelyn. Business dealings that couldn't be aired in public. Political maneuverings. And, sometimes, Edgar would hint they would assist members with delicate situations. Things that needed to disappear." She gave a little shudder. "There was that awful scandal, decades ago. Something about a stock manipulation scheme. Names were whispered, reputations almost ruined. But it all simply vanished. As if it never happened. The Leopold was very good at making things vanish." Was Arthur involved in any of that?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity. Mrs. Albright considered, her brow furrowed. "Arthur, he was always a bit of an enigma, wasn't he? Always so calm, so unreadable. Edgar mentioned once, many years ago, that Arthur had a close call with something unsavory back then. Something he was dragged into, and then swiftly pulled out of. Thanks to some very influential friends at the Leopold," Edgar implied. "It saved his career, apparently. But Edgar also said that such favors often came with a price. A debt not of money, but of loyalty. A debt that was never truly repaid." A chill ran down my spine. A close call. A debt. This wasn't just about money or Scarlett's ambition. This was about something deeply embedded in Arthur's past, a dark secret that had been carefully buried, and which Scarlett, somehow, had unearthed. The old newspaper clipping, the one I hadn't even realized I was looking for, suddenly materialized in my mind's eye. A scandal. Names whispered. Vanished. I thanked Mrs. Albright profusely, my mind reeling. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a picture far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined. Arthur, my beloved Arthur, was not the man I had thought him to be. And Scarlett, the seemingly sweet, if ambitious, daughter-in-law, was not merely a gold digger. She was a blackmailer. And she was using Arthur's past, his long-buried secrets, to get what she wanted. The thought was sickening. But it also fueled a new, fierce determination within me. I was no longer just grieving. I was fighting for the truth. For Arthur's real legacy, whatever it may be. And as I left Mrs. Albright's opulent apartment, the first wisps of a plan began to form in my mind. I needed to get inside the Leopold Club. I needed to find out exactly what Arthur had been involved in and what debt he owed. And I needed to do it before Scarlett could completely erase the past, or, worse, before her insidious machinations destroyed everything Arthur and I had built. The information from Mrs. Albright had been a cold splash of water, stripping away the last vestiges of my idealized image of Arthur. He wasn't just a man of quiet integrity. He was a man with a past, a history carefully polished to a reflective sheen, hiding unseen cracks beneath. The Leopold Club, once a quaint anachronism, now loomed as a shadowy institution, a keeper of secrets and fixer of problems. My first thought was to march into the club, demand answers. But decades of polite society had taught me restraint, and the recent events had instilled a potent dose of caution. I was not a woman who stormed fortresses. I was a woman who navigated them with quiet persistence. I found an old, embossed membership card of Arthur's in a forgotten wallet in his dresser drawer. It was yellowed with age, but still valid, a relic of a bygone era. I called the club, adopting a slightly frail, mournful tone. My late husband, Arthur O'Connor, was a member, I explained to the stiff voice on the other end. I was wondering if I might come by and collect some of his personal effects, perhaps a forgotten umbrella or an old book he might have left in the library. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was all I had. The voice, after a brief, formal pause, granted me an appointment for the following afternoon. The tension in the house was palpable. Scarlett's visits became more frequent, her probing questions sharper. She'd drop by unannounced, her eyes scanning my face, as if searching for telltale signs of my digging. "You look tired, Evelyn," she'd remark, her voice laced with what might have been concern, or perhaps veiled satisfaction. "Are you truly sleeping?" All this, digging into the past. It can be quite draining. The word digging hung in the air, a thinly veiled accusation. Then the accidents began. First, my car. I was about to leave for a small grocery run when I noticed a peculiar flatness in the right front tire. A simple flat, I told myself, just bad luck. But when the mechanic came, he showed me a clean, almost surgical puncture, not a nail or a shard of glass, but something sharper, more deliberate. "Looks like someone took a knife to it, ma'am," he said, his eyes meeting mine with an unspoken question. My blood ran cold. A few days later, my landline phone, a comforting presence for decades, suddenly went dead. The phone company technician found that the line had been deliberately severed, cleanly cut, just outside the junction box on the side of my house. "Looks like a professional job, ma'am," he'd said, his brow furrowed. Not just vandalism. My phone, my last direct link to the outside world, was gone. My cell phone, a newer acquisition I rarely used, suddenly felt like a lifeline. The subtle threats escalated. Anonymous letters, typed on cheap paper, would appear in my mailbox, tucked among the bills and junk mail. No return address, no signature. Just short, unsettling phrases. Some secrets are best left buried. Curiosity killed the cat. The past is a dangerous place to visit. They were not overtly threatening, but their message was clear. Someone knew what I was doing. Someone was watching. And they wanted me to stop. The house, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. I started checking the locks multiple times, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window. My once calm routine was replaced by a constant state of hypervigilance. David, caught in the middle of this undeclared war, was visibly struggling. He saw the letters, noticed the car, the phone. He couldn't ignore them, but he also couldn't bring himself to confront Scarlett directly, not yet. "Mother, are you sure this isn't paranoia?" he'd ask, his voice tinged with genuine worry, but also a hint of frustration. "Maybe it's just a string of unfortunate events." "Unfortunate events, David," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended, "that only started after I began looking into your father's past. After Scarlett fainted. After a homeless man warned me about her." He winced at the mention of Scarlett. "She says you're distraught, Mother. That you're not thinking clearly. That your grief is making you imagine things. And you believe her?" I challenged, my gaze unwavering. He hesitated, his eyes betraying his internal conflict. I don't know what to believe. But these things, they're happening. And I don't like it." He was slowly, painfully, coming to terms with the possibility that his wife, the woman he loved, might be capable of something truly dark. He watched Scarlett more closely, his gaze lingering on her whenever she spoke, a new scrutiny in his eyes. He saw the calculating glint, the subtle shifts in her demeanor that I had been observing. I felt a surge of cold dread, mixed with a strange kind of liberation. The line between my ordered, predictable life and a lurking, dangerous reality had blurred. There was no going back now. I was no longer merely investigating. I was defending myself. The day of my appointment at the Leopold Club arrived. I dressed meticulously, not for elegance, but for invisibility. A simple, dark dress, sensible shoes. I wanted to blend into the shadows, to be an overlooked elderly woman. I clutched Arthur's membership card, a small key to a potentially vast and dangerous lock. As I approached the imposing, unadorned facade of the Leopold Club, nestled between an antique bookstore and a high-end tailor, I felt a tremor of apprehension. The bronze plaque by the door, bearing only the club's crest, seemed to stare back at me with silent judgment. This was Arthur's world, a world he had kept entirely separate from mine. And in this world, I sensed, lay the answer to the haunting question: who was Arthur O'Connor, truly, and what secrets had he taken to his grave that now threatened to consume me? I pushed open the heavy oak door, stepping across the threshold into the past, into the heart of Arthur's carefully guarded life, where the whispers were no longer just echoes, but the very air I breathed. The interior of the Leopold Club was a study in hushed grandeur. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, absorbing light and sound. Plush oriental rugs softened every footfall. The air hung thick with the scent of old leather, polished brass, and the lingering aroma of fine cigars. It was a place designed for discretion, for quiet power. A young, impeccably dressed man greeted me with a polite, almost reverent bow. "Mrs. O'Connor, a pleasure. Mr. Montgomery is expecting you." He led me through a series of dimly lit lounges, past oil portraits of stern-faced founders, to a small, private library. An elderly man, with a shock of white hair and keen, intelligent eyes, rose from behind a large mahogany desk. This was Mr. Montgomery, the club's long-serving archivist, as formal and unyielding as the club itself. "Mrs. O'Connor," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A tragic loss, Arthur. A true gentleman. He will be missed." His condolences, unlike Scarlett's, felt genuine, carrying the weight of shared history. I explained my fabricated errand about Arthur's forgotten belongings. He nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Arthur was particular, very organized. I doubt he left much behind. However, I can check for you. While he began a slow, deliberate search through old records, I took the opportunity to subtly steer the conversation. Arthur was always rather private about his club life, I mused, glancing at a shelf filled with ancient tomes. He always spoke so highly of the camaraderie here. Mr. Montgomery paused, a leather-bound ledger opened before him. "Indeed. The Leopold is more than just a club, Mrs. O'Connor. It's a fraternity. A brotherhood built on trust and discretion. Especially in Arthur's time." He looked at me, his eyes sharp. Arthur was a man of great loyalty and great discretion. I seized the opening. "I've heard whispers," I began, lowering my voice, "of an old incident. Something about the club many years ago. A scandal, perhaps?" Mr. Montgomery's gaze narrowed slightly, a flicker of something guarded in his eyes. He closed the ledger with a soft thud. "The past is often embellished by rumor, Mrs. O'Connor. The Leopold has always upheld the highest standards." "Of course," I replied, feigning innocence. "But I recall Arthur being quite distressed around that time. I always wondered what troubled him." I watched him closely, sensing his internal debate. He was a man of the club, bound by its code, but he also seemed to hold a genuine respect for Arthur and, perhaps, a touch of sympathy for me. After a long pause, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Arthur was a younger man then. Ambitious. Naive, perhaps, in some matters. He was indeed drawn into a difficult situation. A financial venture orchestrated by certain unscrupulous individuals within the club. A stock manipulation scheme, as you may have heard. Arthur, with his keen mind, uncovered the extent of the deception. He was prepared to expose it." My heart pounded. This was it. The truth. "But he didn't, did he?" I prompted, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Montgomery shook his head slowly. "No, because the individuals involved were powerful. Their connections reached far. They threatened Arthur. Not just his career, but his very future. His reputation, his standing in society. Even, it was hinted, his personal safety." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in memory. "Arthur was a good man, Mrs. O'Connor. He simply found himself in an impossible position. He sought counsel here, at the club. And a very influential man stepped in." "Who?" "Mr. Alastair Thorne," Mr. Montgomery said, his voice almost reverent. "A titan of industry, even then. Unimpeachable. He had a soft spot for Arthur, saw his potential. he intervened. The scandal was indeed vanished, as you put it. But in exchange, Arthur owed him a debt of gratitude, a lifelong allegiance. Mr. Thorne ensured Arthur's silence and his rise. And in return, Arthur was bound to him, to his interests. He became, in essence, Mr. Thorne's man inside O'Connor Holdings. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Arthur, beholden to a powerful figure, forced into a lifetime of unspoken service. It explained so much. His occasional weariness, the guardedness, the almost imperceptible air of obligation that sometimes settled on him. He hadn't just been a successful businessman, he had been a man with a hidden master. And the Leopold entries in his notebook, the strange financial records, they were not just jottings. They were a ledger of his silent servitude. And Scarlett? I asked, the word a bitter taste in my mouth. How does she fit into this? Mr. Montgomery's expression hardened. Scarlett. A very ambitious young woman. Too ambitious, perhaps. She appeared on the scene shortly after Arthur became more central to Mr. Thorne's operations. Arthur was mentoring her, or so he said. But I always sensed a different dynamic. She seemed to know things she shouldn't have known about Arthur's past. She had a way of manipulating him, even then. He lowered his voice. There were rumors that she was related to Mr. Thorne. A distant niece, perhaps. Or something more intimate. Mr. Thorne was known to have a wandering eye in his younger days. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The big man Jimmy had mentioned. The influential figure with whom Scarlett was seen. Alastair Thorne. The young woman in the photographs I had yet to examine. Could Scarlett be more than just a manipulative daughter-in-law? Could she be directly connected to the very man who had controlled Arthur's life? Did Arthur ever try to free himself? I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of this new, painful knowledge. He tried, I believe, Mr. Montgomery said, a sad look in his eyes. Towards the end, he seemed restless. He started making discreet inquiries, trying to gather information. I believe he wanted to finally break free, to protect his family from the lingering shadows of his past. But Mr. Thorne doesn't release his hold easily. He then looked at me, a genuine concern etched on his face. You should be careful, Mrs. O'Connor. Very careful. You are treading on dangerous ground. I thanked him, my mind buzzing with this overwhelming cascade of information. Arthur, a man of integrity, forced into a life of servitude. Scarlett, not just a schemer, but potentially a pawn or even an active participant in Mr. Thorne's long-running influence over Arthur. The inheritance, the shares. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Control over Arthur's legacy, control over the company, control over any remaining secrets. I left the Leopold Club, the grandeur now feeling like a gilded cage. The world outside, usually bustling, now seemed fraught with unseen threats. I was no longer merely investigating. I was unraveling a lifelong deception. I realized that Arthur had been trying to leave me clues, to warn me. His sudden death now seemed less like a natural tragedy and more like a convenient elimination. Back in the safety of my study, I immediately turned to the hidden panel in Arthur's desk, the one I had instinctively known was there, but had never opened. With trembling fingers, I found the latch, a tiny, almost invisible button. The panel slid open with a soft click, revealing a shallow compartment. Inside were not just old letters, but a small, locked metal box. Using a key I found on Arthur's old watch chain, the one he always kept tucked under his shirt, I opened it. Inside, neatly stacked, were more documents. And photographs. My gaze fell on a faded photograph. It showed Arthur, much younger, standing with a stern, imposing man, Alastair Thorne, no doubt. But next to them, her arm linked casually through Arthur's, was a beautiful young woman. Her hair was dark, her eyes bright and intelligent, a striking resemblance to Scarlett. But no, it couldn't be Scarlett herself, not so many years ago. This woman was older than Scarlett would have been then. A knot of confusion tightened in my stomach. Then I saw it. Tucked beneath the photograph was a faded birth certificate. And the name on it made my world tilt on its axis. The young woman in the photo was Eleanor Thorne, Alastair Thorne's daughter. And under the father line, faintly, was the name Arthur O'Connor, Scarlett's mother, Arthur's illegitimate daughter. And then, the second shock, a more recent photo, this one of Scarlett and Alastair Thorne, shaking hands at a formal event, a look of shared conspiracy in their eyes. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. Scarlett wasn't just related to Thorne. She was Alastair Thorne's granddaughter. And Arthur's own. The truth, once a whisper, was now a roaring gale, tearing through the foundations of my life. Arthur had not only been beholden to Alastair Thorne, he had a secret daughter with his daughter. And Scarlett, the seemingly devoted daughter-in-law, was his granddaughter, manipulated by her true grandfather, Alastair Thorne, to finally claim her rightful inheritance or perhaps to exact revenge for a lifetime of concealment. My vision blurred. Arthur, my Arthur, had led a double life, a life entangled in a web of power, secrets, and a hidden family. And I, his wife of 50 years, had been utterly oblivious. The word killer from Jimmy, the fainting spell, the relentless probing, it wasn't just about money. It was about a hidden legacy, about retribution, about the complete erasure of my life with Arthur, to make way for the truth that Scarlett and Alastair Thorne were desperate to claim. The game had just turned deadly, and I was standing on the battlefield, armed only with a shattered heart and a terrifying, newfound truth. The world, once a familiar landscape, had become a shifting, treacherous terrain. The revelations from Mr. Montgomery and the hidden compartment in Arthur's desk had torn away the last vestiges of my innocence. Arthur was not just a husband with a secret past. He was a father of a hidden child, bound by a dangerous debt and manipulated by the very man who had saved him. And Scarlett, my daughter-in-law, was not just an ambitious woman. She was a direct descendant of Alastair Thorne, a secret granddaughter claiming her birthright, perhaps even seeking retribution. The weight of this truth settled on me, heavy and cold. It explained everything: Scarlett's possessiveness over Arthur's legacy, her calculated charm, her sudden faint at the sight of me, a tremor of fear that her secrets were unraveling. My initial shock slowly transformed into a burning resolve. I was not just fighting for my inheritance, I was fighting for the memory of the Arthur I knew, for the dignity of my life with him, and for the integrity of the family name. The threats escalated from subtle warnings to outright acts of intimidation. One evening, as I was drawing the curtains, I saw a figure lurking in the shadows across the street. A tall, broad-shouldered man, his face obscured by the darkness, watching my house. He stayed for what felt like an eternity before melting back into the night. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. The next morning, I found a dead blackbird on my doorstep, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. It was a clear, chilling message. A symbol of death, a warning of what awaited me if I continued my digging. My hands trembled as I picked it up, feeling the cold, lifeless weight of its small body. I moved through my days in a haze of hyper-awareness. Every unfamiliar car, every unexpected sound, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I installed additional locks on my doors and windows, and kept a heavy, antique brass letter opener by my bedside. The genteel widow had become a sentinel, guarding her home against an unseen enemy. David, bless his naive heart, was a shadow of his former self. The facade of his perfect marriage was crumbling before his eyes. The accidents and anonymous threats were undeniable now. He came to my house frequently, his face etched with worry, his usually composed demeanor frayed. He'd try to rationalize the incidents, but his voice lacked conviction. One evening, I made a decision. I couldn't keep this from him any longer, not when his own life, and perhaps mine, was in danger. I sat him down in the quiet of my living room, the lamps casting a warm, deceptive glow. "David," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "There are things you need to know about your father. And about Scarlett." He looked at me, his eyes wide with apprehension. "Mother, what are you talking about?" I started with the Leopold Club, the stock manipulation scandal, Alastair Thorne, and Arthur's lifelong debt. I watched his face crumple as I recounted Mr. Montgomery's words. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. And then I continued, my voice almost a whisper, there's this. I handed him the faded photograph of young Arthur, Alastair Thorne, and Eleanor Thorne. Then, the birth certificate. David stared at it, his face draining of all color. He read the names, his lips moving silently. Eleanor Thorne. Father, Arthur O'Connor, he mumbled, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing pain. Scarlett's mother was my father's illegitimate daughter? I nodded slowly, my own pain mirroring his. And Scarlett, she is Alastair Thorne's granddaughter. It seems Alastair used his own daughter to bind Arthur, and now he is using his granddaughter to claim what he believes is his, or simply to exact his own form of revenge. He dropped the papers, burying his face in his hands. The perfect family, the flawless life he believed he had, was shattering around him. His wife, the woman he had loved and trusted, was a deceitful blackmailer, potentially even a conspirator in his father's death. And his father, the paragon of integrity, had lived a lie. She knew, he finally said, his voice muffled. Scarlett knew about all of it, didn't she? That's why she always wanted to control the company shares. That's why she was so keen on the will. Yes, I confirmed, and I believe she and Alastair Thorne used that information to manipulate your father, especially in his last months. To ensure the will was written in their favor. Perhaps even to hasten his end. The unspoken word, murder, hung heavy between us. David lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed, but now burning with a cold fury. The shock was still there, but beneath it, a new steel was forming. He might have been a man caught between loyalties, but he was still my son and Arthur's son. What do we do, Mother? He asked, his voice firming. How do we fight this? A wave of relief washed over me. I wasn't alone. We fight with the truth, David, I said, a flicker of my old resolve returning. We expose them. But we have to be smart. They are powerful. And they are dangerous. I laid out the fragments of my plan, the nascent ideas that had been swirling in my mind. We had to prove Scarlett's manipulation, Alastair Thorne's involvement, and, if possible, shed light on Arthur's true final intentions. We needed more than just whispers and old documents. We needed something that would force them into the open, something irrefutable. And for that, I knew I needed the most unlikely of allies. The next day, I found Jimmy again, near the same alleyway, huddled against the chill. He looked even more worn than before, but his eyes still held that sharp, streetwise intelligence. I recounted the full story, omitting nothing. The Leopold Club, Alastair Thorne, the hidden parentage. Jimmy listened, his expression a mixture of awe and grim understanding. She's a real viper, that one, he muttered, shaking his head. And that old man, Thorne, he's the head of the snake. I need your help, Jimmy, I said, looking him squarely in the eye. You see things others don't. You move through the shadows. I need you to be my eyes and ears. To help me find a way to expose them. He looked at me, then at the bustling street, then back at my determined face. A slow, knowing smile spread across his grimy features. For Arthur, he said, his voice surprisingly strong. And for you, lady. We'll show them. We'll show them all. A shiver of anticipation, cold and thrilling, ran down my spine. The stage was set. The players were in position. And I, Evelyn O'Connor, the grieving widow, was finally ready to face the truth, however devastating, and reclaim what was rightfully ours. The battle for Arthur's legacy, and for my own peace, was about to begin. The air in my living room crackled with a tension thicker than the humid summer air outside. I had chosen my home for the confrontation, a subtle assertion of my remaining control. The antique mantel clock ticked with an unnerving regularity, each beat a hammer blow against the taut silence. Scarlett sat opposite me, draped in a silk dress that shimmered under the chandelier, her composure a brittle veneer. Beside her, David, his face a mask of barely suppressed fury and pain, his posture rigid. And then, Alastair Thorne. He sat slightly apart, a looming, almost reptilian presence, his silver hair immaculate, his eyes, cold and assessing, missing nothing. Mr. Harper, Arthur's solicitor, sat at the head of the table, looking distinctly uncomfortable, his usual professional detachment replaced by a wary anticipation. I had sent out invitations, formal and polite, for a final discussion regarding Arthur's estate, with newly discovered information. The wording was deliberately vague, designed to pique their curiosity and, more importantly, to instill a sliver of fear. Jimmy was not in the room, but I knew he was close by, a discreet witness, his presence a silent promise of unseen eyes. I took a deep breath, the scent of fresh-cut roses in a vase on the coffee table doing little to soothe my pounding heart. This was it. The moment of truth. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice surprisingly clear and strong. "As you know, the past few months have been challenging. However, certain revelations have come to light that necessitate a reevaluation of Arthur's true intentions regarding his legacy." Scarlett offered a brittle smile. "Evelyn, dear, we've been over this. Arthur's will was clear. Perhaps your grief is still clouding your judgment." Her voice was dismissive, condescending. Alistair Thorne merely watched, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "On the contrary, Scarlett," I retorted, meeting her gaze squarely. "My judgment has never been clearer. It seems Arthur was a man of many secrets. Secrets I have only just begun to uncover." I began methodically, calmly. First, Arthur's personal notebook. I opened it to the pages detailing Leopold and the cryptic financial entries. "These," I stated, my voice steady, "are not simply notes. They are a ledger. A ledger of a lifetime of obligation to a man who saved Arthur from ruin in his youth." I looked directly at Alistair Thorne. "A man who then used that debt to control Arthur's life and to secure his own influence within O'Connor Holdings." Thorne's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Scarlett shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing. David leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table. "Mr. Montgomery of the Leopold Club," I continued, "was quite forthcoming about the stock manipulation scandal decades ago. About Arthur's close call. And about your intervention, Mr. Thorne." Alistair Thorne scoffed. "Rumors, Mrs. O'Connor. Old gossip. Arthur was a friend, a business associate. Nothing more." "Was he Mr. Thorne?" I countered, pulling out the faded photograph of young Arthur Thorne and Eleanor Thorne. "Or was he also the father of your daughter's child?" I placed the photograph on the table, then the birth certificate. Eleanor Thorne. Father, Arthur O'Connor. Scarlett's mother and Arthur's illegitimate daughter. A secret he carried his entire life, bound by your influence, Mr. Thorne, and later, by the blackmail of his own granddaughter. The impact was immediate and devastating. David gasped, a raw, guttural sound of pain. Scarlett's carefully constructed facade shattered. Her eyes started from the documents to Thorne, then to me, a mixture of rage and terror twisting her features. Thorne, for the first time, looked genuinely surprised, a flash of genuine anger in his eyes. "He hadn't expected me to know that. This is outrageous." Scarlett shrieked, her voice losing all its polished veneer. "These are lies. Fabrications." She lunged across the table, trying to snatch the documents, but David, quick as a flash, blocked her. "No, Scarlett," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "They're not. I saw them. Mother told me." And then I continued, my voice rising above Scarlett's frantic protests, when Arthur finally tried to break free, when he began quietly gathering evidence to expose the truth and protect his family, he conveniently died. I looked at Scarlett, my gaze piercing. "You were seen with Mr. Thorne in the alley, discussing Arthur's papers and him being done, weren't you, Scarlett? Just days before his death. My witness will attest to that." Scarlett froze, her face chalk white. Her eyes flickered to Thorne, a desperate plea for help. "And your sudden fainting spell, Scarlett," I pressed, pushing my advantage. "It wasn't stress, was it? It was fear. Fear that I knew. Fear that the truth of your blackmail and your manipulation was about to come out. You blackmailed Arthur, didn't you?" Used the secret of his illegitimate daughter to force him to change his will, to give you control over his company. And when he resisted, when he tried to fight back, you silenced him. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. Alistair Thorne, regaining his composure, stood up, his presence radiating menace. "This has gone far enough, Mrs. O'Connor. You are making wild accusations, slandering good names." "Am I?" I challenged, my own fear now subsumed by a righteous fury. "Or are you simply trying to protect your own carefully constructed empire of lies, Mr. Thorne? The same empire that crushed Arthur's spirit and ultimately, perhaps, ended his life." Scarlet, cornered and exposed, finally broke. The meticulously crafted mask crumbled, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath. "He was a fool," she screamed, tears of rage streaming down her face. "A weak old man, clinging to his secrets. He owed my grandfather. He owed my mother. It was our right. Our legacy. He always kept us in the shadows, always chose you." Her words, bitter and venomous, confirmed everything. The hidden lineage, the resentment, the desperate grab for control. David stood up, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, but a single, undeniable truth now shone in his eyes. He grabbed Scarlet's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You knew," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You knew about all of it? And you used it against him? Against us?" Scarlet tore her arm away, her eyes blazing. "You wouldn't understand, David. It was for our family. For our future. Our future." David retorted, his voice rising. "Built on lies? On blackmail? On potentially killing my father." Mr. Harper, seeing the situation spiral, intervened, his voice firm. "Mrs. O'Connor, do you have concrete evidence of these claims, particularly regarding Mr. O'Connor's death?" "Yes, Mr. Harper," I stated, pulling out a small, encrypted USB drive from my pocket. "Arthur, in his final days, was trying to protect us. He recorded conversations. He documented his struggle. He knew he was in danger. And he left this for me." I looked at Alistair Thorne, then at Scarlet. He was meticulous. And he was determined. He left a trail, knowing I would find it. He left the full story. The color drained from Scarlet's face entirely. Alistair Thorne, for the first time, looked truly rattled. His cold, calculating eyes flickered to the USB drive, then to me, a terrifying understanding dawning in their depths. The game was up. Arthur, even in death, had outmaneuvered them. Just then, a discreet tap came at the door. Two uniformed police officers, whom David, at my earlier, quiet instruction, had been called to wait outside, stepped into the room. Jimmy, unseen but effective, must have given them the signal. "Mrs. O'Connor," one of the officers asked, his gaze taking in the chaotic scene. "We received a call regarding potential blackmail and endangerment." Scarlet, seeing the officers, let out a choked sob. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, simply narrowed his eyes, his mind already calculating his next move. "Officer," I said, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering on Scarlet, "I believe my daughter-in-law, Scarlet O'Connor, and her grandfather, Alistair Thorne, are responsible for the manipulation of my late husband's will and, potentially, for his untimely death. I have evidence." I held up the USB drive, a silent weapon in my trembling hand. "And I have a witness." The room plunged into a stunned silence. The ticking of the clock suddenly sounded deafening. Scarlet, completely exposed, completely broken, stared at me, then at David, then at the officers. Her last vestiges of composure evaporated. She crumpled to the floor, not in a feigned faint this time, but in genuine, shuddering defeat. The leech, as Jimmy had called her, had finally been exposed. And the long-buried secrets of Arthur O'Connor had finally, devastatingly, come to light. The aftermath was a tempest. Scarlet was taken away by the officers, her furious, tearful protests echoing down the hallway. Alistair Thorne, maintaining a chilling, almost regal composure, offered no resistance, but simply stated, "My legal team will be in touch, Mrs. O'Connor. You have made a grave mistake." His words, devoid of emotion, were more chilling than any scream. He too departed, escorted by the police, his powerful facade finally showing a crack of vulnerability. David, slumped in his chair, stared blankly at the polished mahogany table, the scattered documents, the silent accusation of the empty chairs. The weight of the revelations had crushed him. His wife, a blackmailer. His father, a man living a lie, manipulated to his grave. His perfect world had been irrevocably shattered into a million painful shards. Mr. Harper, surprisingly, was the first to speak. He looked at the USB drive I still clutched in my hand, then at me, his face etched with a mix of shock and reluctant admiration. "Mrs. O'Connor," he began, his voice hoarse, "if the contents of that drive corroborate your story, then we have a very different will on our hands. And a very serious criminal investigation." He promised to initiate the necessary legal procedures immediately to contest the will based on undue influence and potential foul play. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal consultations, police interviews, and media frenzy. The story, once confined to the whispers of old society, exploded into the public domain. Billionaire's widow uncovers decades-old conspiracy, the Thorne empire shaken by blackmail scandal, hidden daughter, stolen legacy. The headlines screamed from every newspaper and news channel. Scarlett and Alastair Thorne became subjects of intense scrutiny, their carefully curated reputations crumbling under the relentless glare of public and legal inquiry. My testimony, supported by Jimmy's crucial eyewitness account and, most damningly, by Arthur's own meticulous recordings, painted a damning picture. The USB drive contained Arthur's desperate, heart-wrenching confessions, his life of silent servitude to Thorne, his deep regret over abandoning Eleanor, his growing fear of Scarlett's manipulations, and his chilling premonition that his life was in danger. He had documented Scarlett's threats, her carefully orchestrated attempts to isolate him, to poison his mind against me, and to force him to sign over more and more control of O'Connor Holdings. The recordings revealed her relentless pressure, her chilling disregard for his declining health, her cold, calculating pursuit of power. It wasn't just about money, it was about the power Thorne sought to wield through his true bloodline. The most agonizing part was listening to Arthur's voice, knowing that in his final days, he had been so tormented, so alone in his struggle. The man I had known, the strong, composed Arthur, had been hiding a profound vulnerability, a deep regret he had never shared with me. My grief, once a quiet ache, now burned with a fierce, almost unbearable pain for the truth he had carried in solitude. David was devastated. His marriage to Scarlett was officially annulled, tainted by deceit and the dark shadow of her crimes. He struggled with the knowledge of his father's secret life, the betrayal, the lies. But in his grief, he found a new sense of purpose. He began to help me, working closely with Mr. Harper, determined to undo the damage and restore the family's integrity. He visited me often, his eyes still haunted, but slowly, a resilience I hadn't seen in him before began to emerge. He was no longer the conflicted son, but a man seeking justice and reconciliation. Arthur's will was eventually overturned. The shares and assets Scarlett had illegally obtained were reclaimed. The true intentions of Arthur, as revealed in his final, desperate confessions, became the guiding principle for the new distribution of his estate. In the midst of this legal and emotional maelstrom, I didn't forget Jimmy. He had been instrumental, his rough exterior hiding a keen mind and an unexpected bravery. I found him a small apartment, helped him secure a job at a local community garden, a place where his quiet, observant nature could flourish. He was hesitant at first and used to kindness, but the gratitude in his eyes was profound. He became a symbol of the unexpected sources of truth, a reminder that heroism could emerge from the most forgotten corners of society. My home, once a sanctuary, then a cage, slowly began to feel like a haven again. But it was a different kind of haven. The ghosts of the past still lingered, but they were no longer unknown, no longer threatening. They were understood, accepted, integrated into the tapestry of my life. I often sat in Arthur's study, the very room where I had unearthed his secrets and looked at his empty chair. The idealized image of him had been shattered, replaced by a more complex, flawed, yet in many ways, more courageous man. He had made mistakes, terrible ones, and he had paid a lifelong price. But in his final act, he had fought to protect me, to reveal the truth, to break free from the chains that bound him. I mourned the Arthur I had lost, the husband I thought I knew. But I also found a new respect, a profound empathy, for the man he truly was, the man who had struggled so valiantly against forces that had shaped his entire existence. The bitter taste of betrayal slowly gave way to a quiet understanding and, eventually, to a fragile sense of forgiveness. The truth had brought pain, destruction, and public scandal. But it had also brought clarity, justice, and a profound, if hard one, wisdom. I had faced the darkness, navigated the treacherous waters of deceit, and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. The sun set over the Brooklyn skyline, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I looked out my window, a cup of tea, Arthur's chipped mug, in my hand. The quiet hum of the city was no longer threatening, it was simply life, continuing its relentless, beautiful rhythm. I had lost much, but I had gained something invaluable: my voice, my strength, and a deeper, more honest understanding of the human heart, with all its light and shadow. I was Evelyn O'Connor, a woman forged anew in the crucible of forgotten stories. Months turned into a year. The headlines faded, replaced by new scandals and fleeting news cycles. The legal battles, drawn out and arduous, eventually concluded. Alastair Thorne, despite his immense power, faced a significant blow to his empire and reputation, though he managed to avoid incarceration through a labyrinth of legal maneuvers and strategic resignations from various boards. Scarlett, however, was not so fortunate. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including Arthur's own recorded testimony, she was convicted of blackmail and fraud, serving time for her heinous schemes. David, though wounded, began the slow, painful process of rebuilding his life and his career at O'Connor Holdings, now free from the insidious influence of Thorne. My brownstone, once a stage for unfolding drama, settled back into its familiar quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of unanswered questions or buried secrets. It was the quiet of a peace hard won, a serenity born from facing the storm and emerging on the other side. My daily rituals, once a comfort, now held new meaning. The morning coffee tasted richer, the scent of blooming jasmine from my garden more vibrant. I spent more time in Arthur's study, but not with a sense of dread or suspicion. Instead, I sorted through his remaining papers, not searching for secrets, but for memories, for the man beneath the carefully constructed facades. I found old love letters, written in his youthful hand, brimming with a passion I recognized. I found sketches of a dream house we had once planned, long before the shadow of Thorne had fallen upon him. These were the true legacies of Arthur O'Connor, the love, the dreams, the complexities of a man shaped by choices he had to make. My relationship with David deepened, stripped bare of all pretense. We spoke openly now, about Arthur, about Scarlett, about the difficult truths of their lives. He visited often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. He sought my advice, listened to my stories, and shared his own struggles and triumphs in reclaiming O'Connor Holdings. He had matured, becoming a man of quiet strength, carrying his father's legacy with a newfound integrity. I decided to honor Arthur's memory in a way that truly reflected his spirit, rather than the darkness that had consumed parts of his life. I established the Arthur O'Connor Foundation for the Arts, dedicating a significant portion of the reclaimed inheritance to supporting young, struggling artists, a passion Arthur and I had always shared. It was a way to channel the bitterness of the past into something beautiful, something that would foster creativity and light, rather than darkness and greed. Jimmy, my unexpected ally, flourished in his new life. He often stopped by, bringing me fresh vegetables from the community garden, his face beaming with a healthy glow I had never seen before. He was a constant reminder that truth could emerge from the most unlikely of places, and that kindness, once extended, could create a ripple effect of hope. His laughter, once a raspy cough, was now a joyful sound, and it brought a warmth to my heart that no amount of money ever could. I would sometimes sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the Brooklyn sky in a symphony of colors. The city lights would begin to twinkle, a vast, luminous tapestry stretching to the horizon. I was an old woman, yes, but I was not broken. The journey had been arduous, exposing the painful truths of betrayal, hidden identities, and long-held secrets. It had shattered my comfortable world, forcing me to confront the darkness that lay beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. But it had also revealed my own resilience, a strength I never knew I possessed. I had navigated the treacherous currents, outsmarted the cunning, and fought for what was right, not just for myself, but for the memory of a complicated man and the future of my family. I had learned that love could coexist with secrets, that forgiveness was a choice, and that the truth, however painful, was ultimately liberating. I sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through me. The world was still full of mysteries, still capable of shocking me. But I no longer feared the shadows. I understood them. And in that understanding, I found a profound, enduring peace. My life with Arthur had been a rich tapestry, now imbued with deeper, more complex colors. And as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, I knew, with a quiet certainty, that a new morning, bright with the promise of an honest future, had truly dawned.